Okay, the recording has started, and this is the October 26th, 2020 Crossplane community meeting. Let's start at the beginning here with our roadmaps and milestones. We briefly went over last time the 0.14 and beyond roadmap here, which is in this presentation deck here. I'm hoping, Phil, will you be able to convert that into like a PR to get the roadmap in the repo updated soon?
Totally. I'm opening it right now. And if you want, I'm happy to give a quick spin through 0.14.
Yeah. I was actually going to ask if you could do that. I could bring it up on my
Sure.
end here, so you don't have to share or anything like that. But yeah, if we kind of went over it last time, so we don't have to go into super detail, but let's definitely go over a quick summary for everybody here.
Yeah, so 0.13 has shipped. So this kind of summarizes what we have in there in the release notes. I'm going to be putting a blog post together for this probably later today or tomorrow, just to kind of recap everything and hit the highlights. And so if we move to the next slide, I'll give us 0.14. Oh, maybe that's slightly out of order. There we go. Yeah, so we're going to try and get in early November, going into KubeCon, composition towards V1 Beta 1, likely to have the claim update propagation. Bidirectional patching may or may not make it. Composition revisions, I think, is hopefully going to be in, and it's possible we'll get all of this, but just on an accelerated time frame, given that the 0.13 was like a little bit later in October. This is a short release.
Just a note on that as well. It is a little bit, I spent all of last week working on our CI/CD systems unexpectedly. So it's a little bit more tight now than it was at the beginning of last week.
Yeah, no worries. And so basically, this is the release before the candidate 1.0 release, which is 0.15. So anything that doesn't kind of get done here is just going to roll into the next monthly release for December. But here, if we just kind of touch on the package manager, trying to get these to V1 Beta 1 if possible. Oh, go ahead, move off it. Oh, sorry. I thought you were saying something. And then hardening and cleanup. So you can kind of see what we have here, deprecating a handful of the things kind of as replaced by composition and the helm provider. And I think that there might be some comments about like how we can potentially improve this for scheduling and some ideas around that. So we can talk about that later. Provider helm moving to V1 Beta 1. And then we have active work going on for, adapting the ACK and Azure ASO pipelines to CodeGen Crossplane providers. So JPipes has a PR or a branch open that we're collaborating with him on in the ACK project. And then similarly, Matthew Christensen and the team out of New Zealand has been working on generating Crossplane provider out of the Azure ASO CodeGen pipelines. And then Casey is working on, kind of codegenning for clouds that don't have a codegen pipeline predominantly. Basically using the stateless Terraform providers to co-generate Crossplane providers. So the goal here is to get to 90% plus coverage in a shorter period of time as possible, and attacking this from multiple fronts. Ideally, having everything, cogen from, to create a native provider, just because that's going to have like the best possible UX, DX, and there's a handful of things that like Terraform doesn't support, as cleanly, but definitely good enough to get us, like 90% of the way there, even with Terraform providers. So super excited about all that coming together. It's unlikely we're going to have a ton of providers, cloud services covered with the CodeGen. It's mainly be like a resource or two. And then we'll basically unleash it on the full set of metadata to generate after we've kind of proven that out. So, but it's looking really promising right now. And then Ohm is going to V1 Beta 1. So just kind of, I don't know if Ryan's on the line, but, we're kind of working to kind of get that so that all the APIs as we go into our 1.0 release, or at least V1 Beta 1 or higher. And so he seemed bullish on that. And that he was just looking for, a way to provide dual API support for, or at least a transition from the production use of that they have inside of Alibaba today of this on V1 Alpha 1 into V1 Beta 1. So yeah, so that's basically 0.14. 0.15, just super briefly, we're treating this as a V10 candidate. There's some additional things here, mainly around like webhooks for validation and conversion, multiple API support, any last bit of hardening that's needed, and then any of the stuff that gets carried over from the previous release, and then a major push forward on the providers. Still in this time frame, not likely to have more than probably like an alpha 1 of the generated APIs, but it will be generating what's kind of currently the V1 Beta 1 best practices. So even though it's an alpha 1, we're just kind of introducing at that level. I think that the objective is to generate it at a V1 Beta 1 or higher quality, and there's a quality doc that I think Mufafik and Dan have been working on. I'm not sure if that's officially cut, but it's been hanging out in draft for a while, so I think it's largely there. Yeah, and then basically just taking OM, any final hardening there, but it's been pretty active, and they just cut a 0.11 a few weeks back, and so it's looking pretty good on all the fronts. So I'll take this, Jared, and get it dropped into the roadmap MD here in just a second.
Sounds great, Phil. Thanks for giving us that update and for making the changes into the roadmap in the repo as well too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sweet. So with that roadmap kind of high level there, we kind of talked about some of the focus areas. I don't think that there's necessarily a need to dive into further details unless anybody has some thoughts or specifics that they want to share about some of the focus areas that Phil was giving a high level overview for. Yeah, there's not anything to dive into there. And then do we have any more thoughts on the release date for this changing, or what it might be? I think we're talking about sometime early November-ish.
Yeah, so it'd probably be around November 5th or the 6th, just so that we can kind of get that out in time for KubeCon and enough bake time there. So that's kind of roughly the time frame that we're looking at. And then similarly in December, if we just kind of roll that roughly a month forward, I think December 4th was the date that we'd be looking to shoot for the 0.15 or really the 1.0 release candidate.
Cool.
I think it just so happens that it's going to be Crossplane's second birthday on December 4th, so that would be super awesome if we could get it out on the birthday. And I think there is an intention as well to take at least one of the APIs to a V1 for 1.0. And so whether that's composition or package manager or both, we'll kind of leave up to some of the async conversation that's happening in the Slack channel and see which one of those is looking like we can go to V1 with, but it's possible that we could go with both. So we'll just have to wait and see.
So speaking of V0.14, I'm going to drop something in the PRs to discuss all that need attention, but there is likely to be a breaking change to V0.14 that needs manual updates to get it working. I'm calling this out specifically because we said in the release notes for 0.13 that wouldn't happen. So stick around to the end of the meeting if you want to hear about that.
Right. Yeah, and I think the intention has always been that, like with the 1.0 release, that we're totally committed to stable APIs and so forth, and we've been moving towards that. And the degree of confidence is going way up. And as we kind of look to some of the forward-looking things that we want to do and kind of forward enabling those, I think that's kind of the trade-off, like accepting some of those changes while we're not yet to 1.0, might behoove us. So yeah, we can wait till the end of the meeting, but definitely for 1.0, making sure that everything's stable, that people can take a hard dependency on that.
All right, so that should be everything then for 0.14 roadmap beyond. So we can pop on down to the community topics section now. Dan, do you want to give us an update on TBS?
Sure, yeah. Krish is actually on this call as well, but we're going to be showing off some of the work with the Quay operator in Crossplane, and that will be a week from this Thursday. So should be a good one.
What is that the normal time slot too, Dan?
Yeah, it'll be normal.
So
time
that's
slot that week.
November 5th?
Yes, November 5th at 9 a.m. Pacific time.
Cool.
As of now.
It's excited to do that. And then I think this Rocco.live, that was like the day of the last community meeting. I think you were doing it later in the day. How did that turn out?
It went really well. There is some good information there if you're interested in the newer features in Crossplane. We walk through kind of like creating a provider, installing a provider, creating a configuration, etc. So a lot of good content in there if you want to see some of the newer stuff in Crossplane 0.13.
Was that like a live stream format or what was it like?
Yep, it was a live stream.
Cool. Did it have a good turnout or what was the audience like?
I actually have no idea. I didn't have the viewer numbers as I was kind of the guest on there, but I could definitely circle back. I think that there's also a recording of it on YouTube, so we could check the numbers there. But it was on one of those restream platforms, so it was going to all the different ones.
Oh,
so
right.
I'm not sure how they aggregate there.
Cool. And who runs Rocco.live?
It's David McKay, and he's a, I guess, developer advocate kind of at Equinix Metal. So me and Marcus were showing him some of the Equinix Metal provider stuff, which was also updated as part of 0.13 to have some new features. So it was interesting.
Got it. Cool. Well, thanks for doing that, Dan. All right. So quick note here on KubeCon North America. So we had 2 talks that got accepted there. I believe that Dan and there's a Stephen Borelli from MasterCard, I believe. I'm sure you all recorded your talk and submitted it on time last week. Nice. Okay, good job for you. Me and Wonderflow from Alibaba and Andy as well too is participating. Did not finish our talk recording on time, so we got an extension from Nancy Lancaster, and our deadline is end of day today. So all of the slides and demos for Crossplane are done and recorded into clips. Waiting for the final recordings from the OHM side. From Andy to be finished off so that we could stitch it all together into the final product and upload and submit it today. So as long as we get that last recording from Andy, then everything should be all good. But and Phil, we were able to add a 4th tutorial exercise there that kind of walks through the AWS reference platform and installs and uses it on Upbound Cloud as well too. So that should be an exciting demo.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to it. That should be super cool.
Sweet. Okay, and then for the CNCF Project Pavilion booth, we got that accepted. We'll have the booth there again. The materials being copied over, so we don't have too much setup this time. And then we did also get an office hours session signed up for on Wednesday, November 18th at 12 noon Pacific. So last time we just kind of gave like an introduction overview of Crossplane, quick demos and such, and then answered any questions from the people attending the office hours. It's a bit informal. It's not like a mandated format. It's really just a Zoom meeting, Zoom presentation that you, to connect with the community and to have a better format than the booth itself, the booth virtual format, which is not ideal. So anybody who is interested in presenting or driving that, just let me know. I'm happy to give anyone the opportunity to present to the community there or the attendees at KubeCon if anyone's interested in that. Cool. And then there's a AWS ACK first code generation PR up? Did anybody who added this or wants to add talk about this?
Yeah. So we're collaborating with Jay Pipes, who is leading AWS ACK, AWS controllers for Kubernetes. And so they're generating code for their controllers that talks with AWS. And this is like the first PR that has that is able to generate a Crossplane provider API type. So what's going to happen, in an ideal case, is that all provider AWS resources that ACK covers, we will also get generated from there. And additionally, we will have some custom code as well, because there are some crazy edge cases in those APIs. So this doesn't have any custom code ability or whatsoever, but in the future we will have pre and post call hooks and a few different things that we can add custom hacks that are result of usage and maturing those controllers. So we will not only rely on the generated code, but that will be our foundation basically for the providers, and it will be generated by AWS tool here. So it kind of has less maintenance cost from our perspective.
That's awesome, Muvafik. It's super exciting to be able to connect into the code gen pipelines from the providers themselves, and have be part of the those pipelines that get the first class treatment. So that's amazing. Was there a lot that you had to kind of figure out and work through, or did Jay kind of get you set up on a good path with everything you needed there?
Yeah, he got me set up. We had a few hack days. Casey used to drive this, and in the last hack day we were together. So this PR is actually most of the stuff here is Jay's work. So I just had to polish it a bit and make it compatible with Crossplane. I've got my own local commits for actual controller code generation, but this first PR doesn't include it because there are a few small things that we need to do in the upstream. So this is a very lean PR that is adds the Crossplane command, generates an API type that's available ECR or SNS. So just a starting point. But I think in the next weeks we can expect more controller code and covering all the available services and that stuff.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thanks for doing this, Muvafik, and great to have the collaboration with Jay. So, if you had to summarize what the gaps are to having a fully working, generated resource, what would you say is left to get that aspect working?
Yeah, so I think the missing parts are right now the ACK specific things. There are a few things that we need to change. For example, we have the spec parameters under for provider, but they just put it under spec, and that's hard coded. So for example, I have a PR that is that is allowing customizing those things, but there are also other things all ACK resources have a specific status struct that is also hard coded. So there are those small things that are hard coded there.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to make them more generic, and then the latest APIs are modern APIs are kind of easy to generate, but for the older APIs in this repo you can also see for older APIs there are all sorts of hacks.
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to basically reuse the hacks that are put in here for those older APIs. In the beginning we will have some hand holding for specific resources, for example S3 or SQS, vastly different. But in the future I can expect accelerating, adding services, new services. And also shout out to Casey. I've just joined a few weeks ago, 1 or 2 weeks ago, but he's been driving this with Jay. Thanks to Casey.
Yeah, awesome work. Super cool to see this coming together.
Thanks to Casey, indeed. Right on. Cool. Good stuff. All right. So that's the end of the community topics section. So we have a couple of PRs to discuss and that may need attention. So here is, it looks like everything's under a list of 0.14 related changes. Looks like Dan, you've got the first one there. Or is this like a greater topic to discuss that Nick was bringing up earlier? I'll give the floor to you guys.
Yeah, I'll let Nick talk about the breaking changes. It looks like he's got them grouped pretty well there. But I do have one just above that that I'd like to touch on real quick.
Oops.
This is an open PR. It's currently in draft, but I'll move it out of draft today. I demoed it last week. But essentially, right now with the package pull policy, what we're doing behind the scenes is whether you set always or if not present, anytime the package manager requeues a reconcile, it's going to check and basically make sure that the digest of the package that you have installed has not changed. And if it has, then it's going to create a new revision. And whether that actually gets enabled depends on your activation policy being manual or automatic. And we don't actually explicitly requeue the package manager controller. But it will get triggered every so often just by resyncs or if the status of a revision changes or something like that. So basically what this PR is doing is changing if not present to be the default. Well, I guess it was already the default, but it's making it the default still. And if we have if not present and we have an existing package revision and we have our status of our package manager available, we'll skip pulling or we'll skip checking the digest again. So we won't try an update. And if you lost the status of the package resource provider configuration, then we will. And then in always, we're actually going to requeue a reconcile. I think it's after a decently long period of time, like 5 minutes or something like that. And we'll continuously check the digest. So if you wanted to, automatically have your packages update on a channel, so let's say you had it tagged to alpha or something like that. If you had always, we're going to consistently check and make sure or see if there's a new version available and go ahead and create the revision. Once again, its activation will be based on your activation policy. But for most people, if you're just creating the provider configuration using the CLI, this isn't going to change behavior as much, but it does expand what you can do. So it's not going to remove anything, but it adds some new behavior. So I just wanted to surface it because it will be technically new behavior in the new release. But I think it's overall an improvement and won't break anyone.
Great, Dan. Thanks for making a note of that for us. All right, then Nick, you want to take away the changes for 0.14?
Yeah, so the first one I grouped in was Dan's. I have a good idea of, well, maybe not a good idea. I have an okay idea of what that is. So Dan, this was just that we, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a field in 0.13 on providers and configuration, so the package types that constrained what Crossplane version you could use those types on, but it wasn't actually honored, so we didn't actually use it, so I doubt anyone's actually setting it at the moment. Hopefully, I don't think any of our examples set it. So I believe that changed from just Crossplane to Crossplane version or something like that, Dan, was it?
Yes, its version is now nested under Crossplane.
Got it.
And I guess so. The behavior change is actually not breaking, right? Because if you gave it the exact same configuration, then you'd get the exact same result. However, something I noticed while implementing this, it's a schema violation to have Crossplane and then the string value there as it was before. So if you actually try and install a configuration or provider that has that unhonored Crossplane field there, then it's going to fail to install because it's going to be not recognized by the parser as valid schema for the meta type. So in that regard, a existing package could fail to install now.
So, but to your knowledge, the only reason someone would have an existing package that had this field set would be they wouldn't have got it from any of our examples or documentation apart from docs.crds.dev, right? So they would have had to author a package and set that field, not knowing that it was not actually honored by the package manager yet.
That's exactly right. And and similarly, since it won't be recognized by the package manager, now if you update your Crossplane CLI and try to build, right, it's also going to reject it and say, I can't build this because it's not a valid schema. So it would have to be an existing package in a registry that was using a field that wasn't honored. When you installed that, it would say fails to install.
Okay, so what I would like to do, and we can talk about this, well, I'll just say it now, what I would like to do for anything that's a breaking change in this release, there's two things that we said in the v0.13 release. One was that we felt very confident in our APIs, and we strongly suggested that there wouldn't be breaking changes. Two of these breaking changes that we're going to talk about now are, I think, fairly minor and unlikely to impact people. One of them is likely to impact basically all users of Crossplane. And so the other thing we said was this would be, v0.13 would be the last release without a supported upgrade path. So supported upgrade path, I think at least means that any of these breaking changes, I want us to have a documentation section on upgrading Crossplane that talks about what you need to do if you are impacted by one of these changes. So for example, in this case, that you need to go and update your packages to remove this field before you update or to rename this field before updating Crossplane. As I'm, I'd love to hear from the community on these if I am wrong, but my suspicion is, given that this field wasn't doing anything and wasn't really documented anywhere, I doubt that many people are setting it. But if they are, then I'd like us to be able to show people what to do with that. Does that seem reasonable, Dan?
Yep, that sounds great.
So I'll go out of order slightly here. There's two other PRs, both have to do with the composite resource definition type. One's migrating us to V1 of, sorry, this is V1 XRDs. It's supposed to say V1 CRDs. One was migrating us to use V1 CRDs behind the hood, under the hood. V1 CRDs made a tiny change to the additional printer columns setting. Previously, they had a field called JSON path in the additional printer columns that was violating API conventions, had JSON in uppercase. They changed it to lowercase. We're planning on making that change just to match V1 CRDs. So if people have been setting additional printer columns on their XRDs, I kind of, again, suspect that that's maybe unlikely, but if they are, then that is going to be a small change. It should be easy to update. The other one, which is the big one that's probably going to have the most impact on folks, is support serving multiple XR versions. This is in draft at the moment. It's still being tested out, and we're still gathering community feedback. But another thing that came up while we were looking at V1 CRDs is that currently the schema of XRD supports only a single version. So with CRDs, I'm sure most of us on this call know, but with CRDs, you can define a composite resource or a custom resource in Kubernetes terminology, I should say, and you can define multiple versions of that resource. And those versions can have different schemas. So you can have V1 beta 1, V1, have slightly different fields in them. The way that you do that is you write a CRD that in V1 CRDs has an array of versions. You can set which ones are actually served by the API, which one's the storage version, all that good stuff. So XRD didn't do that. XRD only had one version, which means that there would be no path to support multiple versions without breaking changes to that API in future. As we head towards V1, we're actually hoping, I don't want to be the boy who cried wolf here, but we're hoping for v0.14 that this is actually the final form of these APIs, that effectively the last breaking change before V1. So we're hoping to bump these APIs all to V1 beta 1, as Phil mentioned earlier. And once we do that, it becomes much, much harder to make breaking changes for us. It involves setting up webhooks and conversion and a lot of other stuff if we ever want to make breaking changes. It involves bumping from like V1 to V2, et cetera, et cetera. So when we thought about it, we decided that it would be better to make a breaking change now in order to support serving multiple versions of an XRD, multiple schemas of an XRD. So your XRD can be at V1 beta 1 and at V1 at the same time. So specifically what we plan to include in v0.14 is mostly future-proofing, because we're not actually going to support conversion of XRDs. So CRDs, there's only two ways to support conversion in CRDs. You either say, I support multiple versions and they all have the same schema, so no conversion needed. So V1 and V1 Beta 1, they look exactly the same. We will support that for the limited use cases that it's useful for. But the only other alternative is go write a webhook, which we feel for the XRD experience is a little heavyweight. So as of this release, the plan is for us to not support webhooks. If there's a lot of community feedback that people really want to write their own webhooks to do conversion, then it would be easier for us to open that up. But we hope to provide a better user experience than that in future. So long story short, the schema will change such that instead of one version of a schema in XRD in the type composite resource definition, you will have an array of versions. It should be fairly straightforward, and we plan to document the approach to translate an existing XRD, I should say, into a sort of V1 Beta 1 XRD, and hopefully the process should be roughly stop Crossplane temporarily, apply the new XRD CRD, the one that defines XRD, so that you've got the new schema, update your XRDs to have the new schema, and then start Crossplane again, and then everything should be updated. So it should be a manual change, but it won't require you to delete your infrastructure or anything like that. And as I say, we plan to have this documented and tested so that you can sort of follow the steps rather than having to figure it out yourselves. And I apologize for making promises about not making breaking changes, but as we say, we are getting close to V1 when we will be holding ourselves to that much more strictly. Does anyone have
Nick,
questions?
I think it's really good there, Nick, that the steps to upgrade we anticipate will, yes, a manual step to upgrade. Well, we haven't really even supported upgrades in the past, so that's already a step forward. That's progress, but without having to delete or recreate or delete infrastructure resources. So I think that migration or upgrade step there, with having that property is very good.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing to consider here is that if we bump these APIs to V1 Beta 1, one way that could happen would be that we would just delete the V1 Alpha 1 APIs, and you would have to migrate everything to V1 Beta 1 with this release. Depending on how we do it, we could potentially serve both versions at the same time of our types if they have the same schema, but that's not going to happen for these ones that have breaking changes. So I think I definitely want to hear from the community how much of a pain it would be, for instance, if we did take these things to V1 Beta 1 in this release, and that involved, V1 Alpha 1 going away for all of our resources. I guess, long story short, I'd love people to weigh in on these things and let us know if this would be very painful, because there are things we can do to make this breaking change not affect people and happen automatically. It would just likely significantly delay the release.
And one of the things, to think about is that we're also going to be adding support for the, the conversion webhooks as we go into 1.0. So going forward, we will be able to support, a seamless upgrade strategy, and support multiple APIs at the same time, so that, you're not forced to just cut over. But in this interim period, pre 1.0, we feel like we still have a little bit of flexibility, but going forward, definitely taking that super seriously, especially after we get to 1.0. But if there are things like Nick pointed out, that folks are using today that they would be impacted without having kind of a cleaner upgrade path from 0.13 to 0.14, definitely reach out on Crossplane Slack and let us know.
And a good test case there may be the AWS reference platform that we have, because that has defines a number of XRDs in there. and making sure that that upgrades smoothly, using that as a test case to make sure our migration or upgrade plan works, or how much pain there is associated with it, might be a good test case to use.
Absolutely.
Cool. And Nick, did you already drop a note in Slack about this as well too, to try to reach more folks for comments or opinions?
I did last week.
Okay, cool. Okay, if there aren't comments, further comments right now, then we can move ahead to the final section of the community agenda. Does anybody else have any other topics for the group here before we move to the final to optional segment for technical dives? Oh, shoot. Okay. Cool. All right, so let's jump into the final section here, and note this one is optional. We're going to dive into maybe some deeper details around some of these topics here, and it is optional. So if anybody wants to take off, they are more than welcome to. Otherwise, let's get the conversation started. So the first one on the list here is from Tim about replication across clusters.
Sorry, I was talking to mute. How are you doing? I need to share, if you could let me share.
Oh yeah, sure. Let me go ahead and stop sharing here, Tim. Let's see. Okay, I stopped. Do you see the button to start sharing? Perfect. I see your screen. Nice.
Okay, so just a rough illustration of what I'm talking about. So basically, I want an orchestration system to push into Crossplane. And you're going to match, it could be a label. This is just an example where I have a label that's ABC, and then every cluster that actually has that label, that service gets pushed down to. So here you can see these particular clouds, they did not get it. And this could be, 2 clouds, it could be 100 clouds, or it could be 1,000 clouds, right? But it's whatever matches that selector, if you will, or label. I'm also open to, I heard the last meeting you guys were looking at OPA integration. I could do it through OPA as well. That through a policy would be might be preferred. But this is, this is pretty simplistic. Right now you do a one-on-one, one resource, target resources to a service. So all I'm saying is that I want a service to actually match multiple targets based on a label or a policy. I don't know that there's much more to this than that.
So Tim, I know that you were originally looking at this with regard to our workload functionality, Kubernetes application, that kind of thing that is slated for removal in v0.14. And I also know you've been talking about this with Dan a lot more than we've spoken about it, but I recall that we mentioned that the sort of the tentative replacement for the Kubernetes application functionality at the moment is the Helm provider.
Yep.
So do you imagine this being one thing that I'm not sure how much Dan has talked about this with you, but one thing we've talked about in the in my team is potentially supporting this replicability for all Crossplane composite resources. So you could define your own thing that happened to use provider Helm behind the scenes, and that there was maybe if you define a my deployment XR, we would automatically create a my deployment set or something like that allowed you to stamp out multiple templates of those. So I think this is functionality that we're interested in, but I don't think it's functionality that we're going to be able to find time to work on this year, at least.
Okay.
Not without bouncing priorities for other things that we've got going on, like the V1 release and the provider acceleration.
Yep.
So, Dan, do we have an issue tracking this in Crossplane at the moment? Sort of this specific idea that we've had about how we build this?
I don't know if there's a specific issue. There's some with related content, but it'd probably be good to have one that's more specific. Another thing that Nick, I know you've mentioned, and both Tim and I have talked about a little bit, is basically, having a separate controller that has this functionality in it that could operate based on labels or something on resources. So that could either be at the composition level where, you label a XR or something with, my controller / replicate, and then the target label or something like that. And that controller just replicates things. It could be almost a generic thing. It wouldn't have to be specific to Crossplane even. And I know that we've mentioned if that's something that we could get some folks to help out on, we'd love for that to incubate in Crossplane contrib and, be something that we can incorporate into the ecosystem without necessarily, trying to put it into core before the end of the year.
Yeah, I could see this being something definitely that graduated to core if it turned out to be, work well and sort of be popular with the community. Like I can definitely see a path to this being super useful functionality, but I definitely feel comfortable, today raising the issue and making a repo for it to be built in. I just can't commit any time from Upbound folks, I think, this year. So we can definitely put a shout out to the community and let people know that this would be a top priority if people wanted a sort of a larger piece of work to sort of tackle and get involved in the Crossplane community with. And Tim, I'm not sure if there's anyone on your team or yourself who'd be interested in helping with this, but you'd definitely be welcome if it was the case.
Yeah, I mean, I'll see what time we can come up with. The problem is this is just one aspect of a larger picture that we're all trying to get done. So yeah, it becomes hard to find the time. So.
Yeah, understood. I do think it's cool functionality. It's just unfortunately we're down to the wire to try and ship 1.0 at the moment, so I really don't think we have much time to build other stuff in. But post 1.0, which would be January timeline, could be feasible for us to get some time to work on it.
Sounds good.
Cool. So it sounds like we've got some follow-ups there to get the issue opened, and then maybe kind of socialize that issue out to the community as well too, to see if there's anybody who's interested in picking that up or running with that once the issue's opened.
Yeah, Dan, do you feel okay? You've got a lot of context there, or Dan and Tim, do you want to sort of get that written down as an issue that hopefully someone could sort of take and run with?
Sounds great to me.
Thanks.
And thanks for coming to the meeting, Tim, and presenting. It's always helpful. Obviously, we talked about it last week, but it's super helpful when the person who has the most intimate knowledge of it is able to show up. So we appreciate you taking time to be here.
No worries. Thanks for reviewing it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Really appreciate it. Okay, Dan, you wanted to talk about, I'll start sharing my screen again too. This one. Support provider configuration, controller configuration.
Yep. So this one has some pretty good conversation going. If you scroll down on the issue, it's actually an old issue that's kind of been adapted. But I appreciate folks jumping in last week and providing their thoughts on sort of the options that we've defined. But essentially what we're doing is, obviously when you install a provider into your Crossplane cluster, it eventually results in a controller starting to manage the CRDs that you've installed. There are various scenarios where you'd like to be able to configure the deployment that actually creates that controller pod. Some of those, most notably where we've run into it, is with IAM roles for service count on EKS, which involves doing some annotations as well as setting the FS group, which is related to how the service count token is mounted into the pod. So there's a variety of scenarios essentially. And one of the things we've been trying to balance, I guess, is the security concerns of being able to configure kind of like arbitrary workloads running, which you would essentially be able to do if we gave you a full pod spec to be able to configure, while also not being so constrained that we're constantly having to add new fields and eventually end up with basically just our own representation of the pod spec, because obviously that's just more information for folks to have to understand to be able to configure things correctly. So we'd like for it to mirror the thing that's actually getting created. So there's kind of 3 levels at which this can be configured. And currently, there's some disagreement, which I'd like to come to consensus today if possible. But the first level is kind of the install.yaml approach we had before, which is where you specify it when you actually package up the image and say, please deploy it in this manner. That's really not a great solution. And that's what we used before. And we ran into issues with it because not everyone wants to run it the same way. Number 2 is basically configuring the default deployment that the package manager uses to create these controllers at Crossplane runtime. So, either pointing at a config map or, putting something in the file system or setting flags, et cetera, to be able to configure what goes through there. And the third way is to have something like a pod spec on the provider that you actually create, the provider object, or reference from that provider object to a separate resource that has the configuration for the deployment for that specific provider. So we think that 3 is probably, the way that we're going to have to go to enable all the functionality we want. The issue with that is the whole idea of being able to configure sort of any workload to run in a cluster. That's a highly privileged operation. And we don't know if folks that are able to install providers into clusters should have also the ability to basically create arbitrary workloads. Likely, we don't want them to be able to do that. So the way that we could introduce security is at step 2, basically have a flag or some sort of configuration that says, I will allow provider configuration to happen. And that would basically just say to the package manager, check this flag. If provider configuration is enabled, we'll use this pod spec that was provided. If it's not, then we'll just use the default. That's a little bit opaque to the end user. So that could be a little confusing that sometimes when you create a provider with a pod spec, it's going to be used and sometimes it's not, depending on how Crossplane is set up. It's not the worst experience ever. The second option for providing some sort of security boundary is what I previously mentioned, and I think Muvafiq proposes it here, is having a separate resource that is referenced by the provider. So I believe Muvafiq calls it controller config here. So this is a good idea because of the ability to create RBAC specifically on this resource. So you could basically separate the privilege levels. Being able to create a controller config would be highly privileged because, well, I guess being able to create it and a provider would be highly privileged because you're able to configure an arbitrary workload or some subset of that. And then creating the provider would basically be constrained to the controller configs that exist. So basically the administrator of that cluster is saying, you can't create arbitrary workloads, but you can use these types of customizations with your providers when you install them. So I think at this point, it's mostly coming down to, do we embed the pod spec on the provider, or do we reference a separate resource that we can have individual RBAC on? That's kind of a lot of information. Sorry to kind of just dump it out, but if you'd like to review it, it's all outlined on this issue as well. I know Nick and Muvafiq specifically kind of brought up the 2 different options there. So if you all have thoughts, feel free to bring them in now.
Yeah, I think my thoughts personally are pretty well captured on the issue. To try and put it somewhat succinctly, I lean toward making this configurable on the provider CR itself. I lean toward probably not putting in a full pod spec template, and rather than that, doing something sort of, maybe it might evolve toward being a full pod spec template, but doing it on demand basically. So we wouldn't add, we would add just the basic features that we would need, and wouldn't add, I don't know, everything that a pod spec template has unless we had people actually asking for that. I do think it should be optional, so I think you shouldn't have to tell Crossplane how to run your controllers. It should have the same default as it has today. As to how we restrict that, I'm curious as to how many people have that use case. So I know that we definitely have that use case. We run Upbound Cloud, which hosts Crossplanes, and we know that we don't want people who submit providers to Upbound Cloud to be able to configure arbitrary things about the deployments for a provider. If we were the only people who had that use case, it might be feasible to have a separate controller that restricted this, or to use OPA to restrict this. But if this is something that the rest of the community chimes in on and says, yeah, we have that use case too, then I think it makes more sense for Crossplane to have a bespoke security configuration for this.
One thing to mention is if we use OPA, you'd get that kind of like rejection down the line, because the provider would get installed and then the revision and then deployment getting created. And then you'd basically get a failure of saying, this deployment. Well, I guess you could set the OPA actually on the provider itself. So that's
that was my thinking.
Gotcha.
But I presume, I know that Luke and Hassan on the call, even for customers like Upbound Cloud, adding OPA to every deployment sort of thing is a lot of extra resources to be running for every crossplane that you host. So, does anyone on the call have any opinions about this one? Or
So I also write my thoughts about the controller config approach. I think one of the besides from RBAC, using RBAC to restrict it, one of the good things about it is that, for example, let's say I have IRSA, but maybe a different config for IRSA, like 2 of them. So people can choose one of them without going into the weeds of how IRSA works or not. We could have ready-made templates, hey, you just need to put your AWS account ID here, and when you deploy to EKS, you can just choose that one. So that could be a nice UX improvement there.
Gotcha. So you see it as not just a security improvement, but also a nice abstraction for users.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, that definitely. I was rewriting the authentication doc in provider AWS and thinking about the steps there. That definitely is attractive from that perspective, that we could publish along with provider AWS a controller config, right? That's if you like to use IRSA, please, also reference this controller config. I think that's a very valid use case. I think in any hosted solution, you would just give no users the ability to create controller configs, I guess. Or maybe you give users ability to create controller config, but then you put OPA on that, and you can have minimal configuration or something like that. So that could be an option as well. Nick, do you have any thoughts, since that's kind of, I guess, not exactly what you were saying in some ways? Do you see that as kind of a nice abstraction that would be useful to folks?
Yeah, I think that allowing people to point to a predefined configuration is compelling. I guess you could, it's probably worth walking through it a little bit more. I think it makes sense. I mean, you could have a set of predefined providers as well, sort of thing. You could have the IRSA provider and the non-IRSA provider. So there's sort of different ways to accomplish that, but potentially, if Crossplane installed a bunch of controller configs, then the nice thing there is people don't have to necessarily I guess I would probably try and look at it from the lens of what's likely to be the simplest for people to understand. If I need to think about it a little bit more, what I'm wondering is if Crossplane publishes a set of these controller configs behind the scenes with the hopes of someone just saying, give me an IRSA one, presumably you're going to have to say, okay, this provider has a reference to the IRSA controller config or something like that, or somehow defaults to it or picks it or says to go use that one. And then so I wonder if the complexity of moving that out into a different type helps with much, given that people would probably still have to go and see that it exists, find it, look at it, understand what it's doing or something like that. It could I don't know, my initial reaction was, yes, this seems simpler. And then I started to question that. So I don't feel strongly against it. Yeah, that's
Gotcha.
where I'm at with that.
Luke, do you feel like either one of those approaches are easier from a hosting perspective with security?
I guess I'm still kind of waiting to see. It's nice if it's a privileged type and not just ad hoc config, obviously. So the two elements, but I think again it's more about what people need for configurability. In the general community, we can always find a way to harden around it, I feel like. So
Yeah, one thing that would be nice is if we use a separate type, we could potentially make that alpha, and we wouldn't be introducing new fields. So basically, if we went with having it directly on the provider itself, and then we promote that to V1 Beta 1 or V1, we don't want to break that functionality, but we could theoretically have a separate resource at alpha and say, hey, we're dropping this, and we're actually going to put it directly on the provider now. And that would not be a breaking change, right? It would be strictly additive, and we'd only be dropping an alpha resource. So just from a versioning perspective, that could be advantageous as well.
Would we have a default one of these for each provider, or would we just say if there is no default one, we do what we do today? Thinking about the additional complexity of now when we reconcile a provider, like I'm wondering if, okay, I go reconcile a provider, do I have to every time go and also get a provider config to figure out what to do with that provider?
Yeah, I think you would have to, in the case of a provider revision, reach out and get that. We could also, put it in the status or something like that, right? Or late initialize it, or I guess one thing we could do is in the manager controller, reach out and get it, and then create the revision with it in the spec. But if it change, we'd have to think about how we handle if it changes or something like that as well. So
just have a default of basically if there isn't a controller config or whatever we call it, that we just do what we do today.
Yeah, no, I think that is what we do. I'm just talking about if there was one referenced, what we would do. I think if we didn't have one reference, it would be exactly what we do today. I don't think we have I don't think we use a default, which may make that kind of irrelevant anyway. If we're almost always using the default, we wouldn't have to reach out that often, obviously, because we wouldn't be reaching out for anything.
Yeah. The point of making it a separate controller or a separate CR for API stability purposes is compelling. I like the idea that we could make it a separate one and then see how that works. And then if we did decide at one point that we wanted to make it a first-class property of provider and switch to that for whatever reason, that's an easier change to make than pulling it out of provider and putting it somewhere else. So I feel okay about that direction.
I'll write something up to make it a little more concrete before we move forward on implementation or anything like that.
Yeah, just keep a gut check on it as we go with implementing that. If it turns out to be this actually is going to make it more complex to understand and implement than just putting the fields on provider, then we should maybe double check it. But I don't have reason to worry about that being the case too much.
Cool. Thanks, folks.
Right, Dan, I've got to hop off now. Can I go ahead and make you the host to finish off these conversations in the optional period here?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I got to drop as well. So see you later.
Cool. All right. So this next thing, Jan and I were talking about this earlier today, and it's
and you can go ahead and start sharing your screen, I guess.
Okay.
Too then, Dan.
Sounds good.
Thanks, folks.
Let's see here. I guess I can just do Google Chrome. Okay. Can you all see the agenda meeting here? Cool. I'm guessing yes.
Yep.
Cool. All right. So we were talking about this before. Basically, the idea is enabling publishing secrets to external secret stores, be it Vault or Secret Manager or something like that. There's kind of two scenarios here. One of them being if you're comfortable with secrets existing in your Kubernetes cluster, which the case would be I provision my infrastructure and it publishes a secret, which is fine with me, but I want to be able to consume that from the external secret store. So we basically want to sync that Kubernetes secret up to the secret store. And then likewise, you could also manually create a secret and have it synced up there. And to enable this, we could have a fairly simple change that would be non-breaking, to add the secret type to the right connection to secret ref in manage resources. So right now it just has a name and namespace. So we could add the optional secret type right now. If we take a look at this issue, we write it to connection.crossplane.ao/v1alpha1 secret type. So my idea is that we have just basically any type that you can write to, and then we could have controllers for the various secret syncs to reconcile those secret types. So let's say I wrote it to vault.crossplane.io/v1alpha1 secret type. It would create a secret just like normally, but with that secret type. And then I could have a separate vault controller that was saying, I'll go put this in the external store, essentially. So that's kind of the first stage of it. The next would be not writing the secret at all, right? And maybe making a request to some sort of secret backend or something like that. But I think this simple change could enable it in the short term. But it is additional complexity, so always want to consider that when introducing new things. I think we've lost a number of people from the call at this point, so this may just be valuable for the recording. But if anyone on here wants to weigh in, you're definitely welcome to at this point.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for writing that up, Dan.
Yep, sure thing. Casey, I know you've been doing some work with generation related to references and maybe connection secrets as well. I don't think that this would change anything materially for any of the work you're doing, but just wanted to run it by you, just in general as well.
I assume I'll have more questions when there's a design doc for it. The big question obviously is kind of how you manage consistency, if there are other things that can be writing back to these secret stores. But I'll kind of hold off until I see what you got in mind.
Gotcha. Yeah, that is something to take into consideration, especially how we gate on these, because it would essentially allow anyone who creates any managed resource to then write that connection secret to the external store, which obviously may not be desired behavior. So yeah, we'd have to look at that. All right, so we can provide some more information there and probably follow up, chat with some other folks about it as well. We could also maybe do a little Crossplane contrib work on that if we want to get that going a little earlier. Last thing we have here is from Casey, and I'll just let you take it.
Okay, yeah, and we probably want to have this conversation with the full group, but maybe just bring it up now to show that it's something that we're thinking about working on. We just want to develop a better process for keeping stakeholders in Crossplane in the loop on breaking changes, and so we're considering some options about different approaches for release PRs or release branching, and kind of using this community meeting as more of a tool to synchronize around those changes. So I guess stay tuned until next meeting, and we should come back with a more concrete proposal about that.
Yeah, for sure. And if anyone here is a consumer or anyone watching the recording is a consumer of Crossplane, and there are ways that you think would be more beneficial, obviously, I think, simple change log and that sort of thing are very important. And as Casey said, I think we're already making a non-standardized effort to service more of these in community calls as evidenced today. But if there are ways that you say, this is how I typically consume, breaking change information from other projects or other software I consume, and you'd like to suggest that, we are definitely open to that. And so please feel free to add that to this issue. Or I think, was there another issue you had, Casey, as well? I can't remember. Or is that the one?
Maybe you're thinking of, we were linking to the 0.14 release issue on this topic as an example of a place we could synchronize around. But I think it's the only one meta issue.
Cool. Sounds good. All right. Well, I think that we've pretty much let everyone filter out here. But thanks to y'all for staying to the end. And please feel free to mention anything in Slack that you feel like wasn't covered here. And have a great rest of your week. Thanks, folks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.